Chapter 16 Rise of Nationalism 1885 to 1919. Get set. Recognize the following social leaders. Discuss with your teacher about their contribution to Indian society, how their works were helpful to raise the feeling of nationalism. The greatest and the most widespread armed uprising which shook the foundations of the British rule in India was the Revolt of 1857. The accumulating hatred against British rule, which had resulted in numerous, though localized, outbreaks, burst in a mighty rebellion in 1857 that dispossessed rulers of Indian states, the nobles and the zamindars who had been deprived of their lands, the Indian soldiers of Britain's army in India, and the vast masses of peasants, artisans, and the other who had been ruined by British economic policies and had been rising up in revolts in their isolated pockets, were now united by the common aim of overthrowing British rule. A new spirit of nationalism was instilled into the body, mind, and soul of the Indians. They now realized that how they and their motherland were exploited by the cruel British. Chirpy says, nationalism is a sentiment based on common cultural characteristics that binds a population and often produces a policy of national independence or separatism. It involves the feeling of oneness and brotherhood for our own countrymen. The growth of Indian nationalism started in the 19th century. The people of India became aware of the fact that the development of their country was not possible unless British rule was ended. There was a series of famines which took a toll of millions of human lives due to the indifference of the autocratic British administration. Some newspapers were published during this period which played an important role in the rise of nationalism. The British tried to stop them, but, however, they continued to be published. Some of them were the Indian Mirror, Hindu, Kesari, and Tribune. Some important writers and poets also aroused the feeling of nationalism among the Indians through their writings. They were Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Bharatendu Harishchandra, Rabindranath Tagore, Subramanya Bharati, etc. Think a while. Write the names of some other newspapers published during the British rule. Now the Indian rulers, thinkers, and educated people began to realize that India is clutched with many social evils such as sati pratha, caste system, child marriage, killing of female babies, and illiteracy. Indian people started acting and thinking independently. Many associations or organizations were found. Reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, Narayan Guru, Rabindranath Tagore, and Swami Vivekanand started movements to reform society and promote education. Traders and businessmen opened modern mills and factories where a large number of people were employed. They worked together in the factories, lived at the same place, and ate at the same canteen. All these things made them free from the social levels of caste system and filled them with the feeling of nationalism. Formation of national associations. From about the mid-19th century, some national associations were formed which demanded a share in the British government and some rights for the Indians. But their nature and demands were regional. So a need was felt for an all-India organization which would raise the voice of all Indians on a common platform. Therefore, Surendranath Banerjee stepped forward in this regard and founded one such organization known as the Indian National Association. The association worked at the national level and opposed various unjust laws imposed by the British. However, soon this organization came to an end, as many of its leaders joined the Indian National Congress. The birth of Indian National Congress. The birth of Indian National Congress in 1885 gave a final spark to the growth of national consciousness among the Indians. Soon the National Congress gained momentum in the nook and corner of India. It expressed the desires of the people before the British authorities. A.O. Hume, a retired civil servant, was credited with its formation. Its first session was held in Bombay under the presidentship of W.C. Banerjee. The session was attended by 72 important leaders from all over the country. Thereafter, the INC held its session every year in different parts of the country. The INC tried to educate people politically and to persuade the British government to introduce reforms. The most important leaders of the INC were Dadabhai Naoroji, Surendranath Banerjee, S. Subramanya Iyer, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and M.G. Ranade. Indian nationalism was broadly divided into three phases: moderate phase, radical phase, Gandhian phase. Chirpy says, the Indian National Congress was India's first political party. Moderate phase. The moderates advocated and used methods of constitutional agitation for demanding reforms. They had faith in British and thought that the British would agree to their demands. They considered British just and kind. Some of the famous leaders were Dadabhai Naoroji, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and Surendranath Banerjee. Radical phase. The aggressive nationalists had no faith in British rule. They thought that India could not progress under the British rule and freedom was necessary for their development. They believed that this could only be done by adopting aggressive methods. Some of the important leaders were Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bipin Chandrapal, and Aurobindo Ghosh. Gandhian phase. The Gandhian phase was led by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. He devised the methods of ahimsa, non-violence, and satyagraha, insistence on truth, to attain independence. He converted the Indian freedom struggle into a mass movement. Gandhiji played a very important role in the independence of India. Partition of Bengal. The decision of the partition of Bengal was announced in July 1905 by the Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon. The partition took effect in October 1905 and separated the largely Muslim eastern areas from the largely Hindu western areas. The reason behind the partition that was officially announced was that the Bengal province was too large to be administered by a single governor and therefore was partitioned on administrative purpose. But the real reason behind the partition was political and not administrative. East Bengal was dominated by the Muslims and West Bengal by the Hindus. Partition was yet another part of the divide and rule policy. Indians were outraged at what they recognized as a divide and rule policy, where the colonizers turned the native population against itself in order to rule. They protested against it. Both moderate and radical leaders took the lead. Meetings were held and demonstrations were taken out. These meetings and demonstrations ensured the participation of common people, so it became a mass movement. The Swadeshi and boycott movements. The radical leaders encouraged people to protest against this division. They observed strikes and held meetings and demonstrations and marched in the streets singing Vande Mataram. They encouraged people to take a pledge to use only Swadeshi or Indian goods and boycott the British manufactured goods. These movements are known as the Swadeshi and boycott movements. Women and students also came out in support of these movements. Soon these movements spread to other parts of the country. The British tried to stop the movements with brutal beatings, shootings, and imprisonment. In spite of this, the movement grew larger. At last, the British could not stop the movements and they had to abolish the partition of Bengal. Hence, the state was reunited in 1911. The revolutionaries. Many young people were not satisfied with the way the moderates and the radicals were working. They wanted to resist the British by force and revolutionary methods. These people were called revolutionaries. Their leaders were Ajit Singh, Ashwini Kumar Dutt, Khudiram Bose, etc. The revolutionary movement grew in Bengal, Punjab, and Maharashtra. Here secret societies were made in youth. were trained in making and using explosives in firearms. They wanted to strike terror in the British. They targeted the unpopular British officers. In 1908, at Muzaffarpur, Khudiram Bose and Prafulla Chaki threw a bomb at a British coach in which two British women were killed. Chaki killed himself while Khudiram Bose was caught and executed. Many revolutionaries were dealt severely. They were shot dead, hanged, or sent to cellular jail in the Andaman Island. Revolutionaries also got support from outside India. B.D. Savarkar, Shyamji Krishna Verma, Lala Hardyal, Madam Bhikaji Kama, Rash Behari Bose, Muhammad Barkatullah, etc., were active in other parts of the world. The migrants from Punjab who had settled in America formed the Ghadar Party to help the revolutionaries. They collected huge amount of money and bought arms and ammunition and sent a large number of volunteers to India, but the British government became aware of their plans. Many of them were arrested and hanged. The British dealt with them ruthlessly. Chirpy says, Khudiram Bose, a great revolutionary, was only 16 years old when he threw a bomb with Prafulla Chaki at a British coach. First World War. The First World War broke out in 1914. India had nothing to do with the war, but the British sent a large number of Indian soldiers to the war. The Indian leaders decided to help the British. They thought that India would be given freedom once the war was over, but this did not happen. The government made strict laws and enforced them harshly. By this time, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi had returned to India and led the struggle for freedom. Quick review. The growth of Indian nationalism started in the 19th century. Traders and businessmen opened modern mills and factories where a large number of people were employed. The first session of INC was held in Bombay under the presidentship of W.C. Banerjee. The Gandhian phase was led by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. The radical leaders encouraged people to protest against the partition of Bengal. Bengal was reunited in 1911. First World War broke out in 1914.